There are some people it's better to distance yourself from. Why is that? Because in most cases, they just waste our time. The problem is we don't realize it and we stay there, often for a long time or even too long, thinking that maybe there's something good or beautiful to gain from it, when in reality, we just end up sinking deeper into misery. But be careful. Before distancing yourself, there's something you need to do, which I'll explain in this video after I've told you which people you should stay away from. If you don't know me, let me introduce myself. I'm Daniela Coin, a professional educator and Jungian coach specialized in male personal and relational growth. So I help men feel better about themselves and, as a result, have more beautiful and healthier relationships with women. The first category of people you should distance yourself from if you care about yourself are those who are only around when they want to take something but never give anything in return. And you might say, but relationships shouldn't be based on exchange. But that's not exactly true, because if there are people who only call you when they need something, maybe when they're feeling down, or when they need something from you, and then when you need them, they forget you even exist, these are people who actually don't care about you. They're most likely just using you. You need to understand that all relationships, in one way or another, are also and often almost entirely based on exchange. So it's a bit pointless to tell ourselves that we shouldn't base relationships on exchange, when in reality, that's exactly the dynamic of relationships themselves. I'm talking about friendships and work relationships too. They're all based on exchange. We know this, we're aware of it, and we simply live within this kind of dynamic, almost all of us. Of course, a work relationship will, in most cases, be based almost entirely on exchange, while a friendship will also be based on feelings of affection, and a romantic relationship, in theory, should also be based on love. But exchange is still intrinsic, even if the foundation is feeling. Ultimately, it's still normal for there to be an exchange. So if the other person only takes, and when you need something because maybe you need it, because as we said, that's normal, this person is never available, avoids you, is always busy, or maybe says they'll be there, but then they're not. Well, in this case, we're talking about a situation that needs to be ended. You can also, if you want, choose not to end it, but you shouldn't be in a position where you suffer or complain about the situation. That is, where you find yourself complaining every day that you're being used or getting frustrated because you realize you're being used. Obviously, before distancing yourself, there's something you need to do, which I'll tell you at the end. Let's move on to the second category. The second category of people you should consider distancing yourself from are angry people. Why? You might say, poor things, if they're angry, it's maybe because they're suffering and feeling bad. Yes. But living next to a person or having constant interactions with people full of anger, who are always blaming someone, who in some way use passive-aggressive dynamics, who are angry at the world, who spread negative energy around them, this is not healthy. Because even the calmest and most balanced person in the world, next to someone like that, clearly won't feel well. Or even if they are super enlightened and balanced and still feel fine. In any case, they are wasting their time and energy having to somehow detach, disconnect, or distance themselves from this person who tries to involve them in their anger, because angry people always try to pull you into their negative whirlwind so that you end up validating their anger, their sadness, and their resentment toward the world and everyone else. And above all, if you find yourself around these people, there will definitely come a time when you too will become their target, when you too will be the person who, at some point, might be singled out and possibly blamed. Blamed for their frustration, which is clearly at the root, at the base of it all. But of course, they don't realize this and instead project it outward. They carry it deep inside themselves and project it onto the people around them. Those who are constantly angry, and I'm not talking about momentary anger that can happen if something bad occurs or you feel hurt by something, but rather about people who live in a constant state of agitation, who are never calm. These are people you should distance yourself from, people to stay away from because sooner or later they will cause you harm, or at the very least, they are definitely making you waste time and energy that you could be using for something more worthwhile. The third category of people you should distance yourself from as soon as possible are complainers. Those people who spend all day complaining that something is always wrong, that others are wrong or mean, that the world is unfair, that their life is unlucky, and that everyone else is luckier than they are. Well, all these people are quite literally flushing their lives right down the toilet. All those individuals who live in a state of constant victimhood are, in some way, even if not as outwardly as those who are angry or resentful do, still, in reality, blaming others for their misfortunes and their own personal situations. And you might say, Daniela, but poor them, maybe they're really suffering. Maybe they're people who have a reason to complain because they're unlucky. Well, then I have to tell you something, a revelation. Bad luck doesn't exist, or at least in general, there can be events that are beyond our conscious control. Yes, but in 99% of cases, what happens to us is created directly by ourselves, though at an unconscious level, sometimes more unconscious, sometimes less. The problem is that most people don't see that they are creating their own reality. And if you want, I can even give you an example. Very often, men come to me during private sessions and say, Daniela, I wasted months, years of my life with a narcissist who treated me badly, who devalued me, who constantly criticized me and got angry with me. And I don't understand why I always end up with women like this. It's not the first time this has happened to me. It's happened before, and I don't understand why. Here, this is a typical example of creating your own reality, because there are many people who have latent narcissism on an unconscious level. I'll explain this a bit better later, and who project this way of being outward. So they end up choosing people who have that same unconscious trait. But in those people, it is manifest, and they choose those people. Why? Because they need to realize this is how projection works, or the law of the mirror, whatever you want to call it. They need to realize that this trait actually concerns themselves. So they choose unconsciously. That is, their unconscious chooses those specific people, and therefore they will be unconsciously attracted to people who perhaps have that dominant narcissistic trait, a bit more obvious, more manifest. At first, they won't realize they're with these kinds of people, but then at a certain point, the signs will start to show. So what happens then? They will feel like victims. They will feel as if they're undergoing a certain situation that in reality, they have unconsciously chosen because they needed to see that content they weren't aware of. When we don't see one of our unconscious contents, so that's how projection works, we project it outward. Maybe we don't like that content, we've repressed it, and it has become the shadow. Or it could be a quality within us that we need to develop, something we need to cultivate, and we project it outward. In this sense, it could actually be both. For example, the hypothetical man who falls in love with a narcissistic woman who treats him badly and devalues him is probably a man who, on one hand, needs to realize that he himself is devaluing himself in some way. So he is devaluing himself and perhaps also other people, or he is throwing his own life away. And as a result, he is treated this way by others, but he doesn't realize it, not on a conscious level. However, it could also be that he needs to develop some of these traits of the narcissistic person or of this person who perhaps has this overly dominant behavior. Because usually when we project, we tend to project it in a very obvious way onto the other person. It doesn't mean that we have to develop it to that extent, but for example, a man who is always complaining, who always plays the victim, might need to integrate an aspect of the narcissistic person. Because usually a narcissistic person or someone who behaves dominantly towards others is extremely egocentric. So the victim type person should start to develop a bit of that healthy egocentrism, that healthy ability to take responsibility for their own life, which is something the complaining, submissive, and dependent person is not doing. So why does this man keep attracting all these narcissistic women who treat him badly, dominate him, and devalue him? because in part he needs to recognize something within himself, that he too is devaluing himself, probably his own life. And in part, he also needs to acquire some of the healthy traits of a narcissistic person who at the very least takes responsibility for their own life and acts purposefully to create what they want in their life, even though he shouldn't actually become a narcissist. And this is the explanation of how projection or the law of the mirror works, which I wanted to include at this point, but I would have explained it better at the end anyway. To tell you what you need to do before distancing yourself, I'll explain it better at the end. Therefore, since it is us, even if on an unconscious level, who generate most of the events in our lives by making choices guided by the unconscious, people who complain, those who can't understand this, and spend their whole lives complaining, saying, "Poor me, I'm a victim, others treat me badly, I'm unlucky, everything that happens to me isn't my fault, it's the result of fate, of bad luck, of misfortune." Well, these people are useless. These are people who make no sense to keep around because they simply waste your time and energy without getting anywhere. You can't stay close to people like this without becoming like them yourself, wasting your own life. And often, almost always, it's also pointless to try to help them. Therefore, it's better to distance yourself from people like that. The fourth category of people to distance yourself from are those who talk but never accomplish anything, who can't make things happen. These are the people who say, "Hey, let's do this," and then find an excuse not to do it. The people who tell you, "I would really like to be this way, to become like that. Should I try?" And then they do absolutely nothing or almost nothing to actually become that. Or what they do to change is simply not enough. They're also the people who tell you they'll do this or that project, that they'll accomplish this or that in life. And then for one reason or another, which of course is never their fault, they fail to achieve any of the things they said they would. Why is it better to distance yourself from these people? Because they are people who make you waste your time. They are people who, if you happen to believe their words and trust what they tell you, can make you waste a lot of time, potentially even years of your life. For example, if you get into a relationship with a woman like this, someone who makes lots of promises but can't keep any of them, even if she tells you she's trying, of course she's trying with her own tools and means, but if you get involved with a person like this, you'll literally waste years of your life achieving nothing, and in the end, you'll be left with nothing. Because clearly, this person says she wants to do something, but in reality, she doesn't actually want to do it. The fifth category of people to stay away from are, of course, violent people. And by violent, I don't just mean physically violent, which obviously it goes without saying that you should stay away from people who are physically violent, meaning those who commit acts of physical violence. But we're also talking about people who are violent verbally and emotionally. Emotional violence occurs when someone controls you, drains you, shuts you down, and it often consists of looks that humiliate you, words that hurt you, or silences that somehow punish you. So these are the feelings that make you feel like you're in the wrong, even if you haven't actually done anything. Emotional violence is also present when someone manipulates you to make you doubt yourself. This is called gaslighting. By the way, I talked specifically about gaslighting in a video that I'll link up here and also down below in the description. And I discussed emotional manipulation in another video as well. If you haven't seen it, I recommend you watch that one too. I'll link it up here as well, and I'll put it together with the other one down below in the description, so you can watch it at the end of this video. Why is it important to distance yourself from people who engage in emotional violence or who use a passive-aggressive way of communicating, who make you feel guilty and constantly doubt you? Because these are people who, if you don't have solid self-esteem and a strong sense of self, can drag you down. But in general, even if you're someone who is strong on the inside, interacting with people like this doesn't nourish you, it doesn't enrich you. In other words, it doesn't do you any good. So from my point of view, it's better to distance yourself from people like that. Even if you might say, poor things, they've suffered. That's why they act this way. Yes, it's true. If they behave like this, they have suffered. But in any case, that doesn't give them the right to constantly mistreat other people. So, from my point of view, people like this should either stick together or get some therapy so that at the very least they can function reasonably well when interacting with others. Another category of people to distance yourself from, again, mainly to avoid wasting too much of your time, are chronically confused people. That is, all those who don't know who they are, don't know what they want, don't know where they're going, and until they figure it out, they just keep going around in circles. And what mainly happens? They latch onto you to give themselves a sense of identity. But since you are not a crutch, nor are you the person who should give them direction, unless you want to play the rescuer, in that case, whether it's in relationships or even with friends, generally these people slow down your growth and make you waste time. And so, from my point of view, even if they aren't as harmful as the ones I mentioned earlier, they are still people you're better off distancing yourself from if you want to lead a rich life full of wonderful things. These are people who can weigh down your life and therefore should be kept at a distance. And finally, even though I could mention many more, I don't want to make the video too long. Finally, the last category you should stay away from are those who are emotionally immature. That is, all the people who can't go deep, who don't recognize their own feelings, who run away, distance themselves, or change the subject when you try to talk about something more serious, because maybe all they want is fun, lightness, and zero responsibility. But in general, human relationships they're not made up of just that. They're made above all of looking within yourself and having a deep connection first with yourself and then with others. Because then these people, especially from a relational and emotional point of view, are also the ones who, when the relationship starts to get a bit more serious, when their partner asks for a greater commitment, maybe, I don't know, to start a family, to live together, to make plans, these are the people who, at the first excuse, run away because they're not capable of building a mature, serious, and deep relationship. And since relationships require reciprocity, and if you're following this channel and you've made it this far into the video, you probably have a certain level of depth and want to do something meaningful with your life. Well, from my point of view, these people are actually harmful to you. They are, again, an incredible waste of time because you could use that time for yourself, or even better, for someone else who is more in harmony with who you are. What did I want to say in conclusion? Why is this important? Before distancing ourselves, as I explained earlier when I talked about projections, it is essential to understand why we attracted this person into our life, or, in any case, for what reason this person was drawn to us. Because in general, if we are attracted to a certain person or welcome them into our life, as I mentioned before, there is a reason. It means that this person has something to show us. So yes, let's distance ourselves because these people only make us waste time and slow down our evolutionary path. But before we distance ourselves, we need to understand what this person is meant to show us. And then we distance ourselves. In reality, most of the time, these relationships, these unbalanced ones, only serve to show us either a part of our shadow, an aspect of ourselves, as I explained earlier, that we don't want to see or acknowledge, but actually need to see and integrate, or an aspect that we should realize in our own life because it could be good for us, but we are unable to see or achieve it ourselves. So we project it outward with the purpose of admiring it, in this case, in someone else. So if we admire a person or are attracted to a beautiful quality in that person, it's because we also want to integrate and absorb that quality ourselves. On the other hand, when another person harms us, hurts us, or makes us angry, they are probably showing us a side of ourselves that we have repressed because we didn't want to see it, and we need to see, accept, embrace, and integrate it. This is explained in a simple way, okay? So before we distance ourselves, let's do this work. which is extremely useful. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please make sure to leave a like, share the video with people who might benefit from this content, and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. I'll leave the subscribe button here in the center, and up here I'll leave 2 videos for you to explore these topics further.